Home Furnishings Association members and stakeholders, vendors, suppliers, and everybody else connected to the home furnishings industry. It's Friday, April 4th. Theoretically, the end of a rather impactful and chaotic week in Washington, D.C. For those that don't know me, my name is Chris Andresen. I'm the service part of the team with my partner Bill Simmons at Dutko Government Relations for the Home Furnishings Association on the ground in Washington, D.C. And pleased to be giving this video update to you as you're following a lot of the impactful trade policy pieces that have been announced this week by the Trump administration, and the various actions that are now being put in place after those announcements. And so it's a pleasure to be with you today. And I'll be referring throughout the discussion to the HFA website. I know that we have an active blog post there and some other resources as it relates to the trade and tariff issues that are ever changing. And, potentially, as we're giving this discussion on April 4th, some of these orders go into effect in the coming days. Potentially there's deals that are announced by the administration with some of these countries that may make this discussion less impactful. We'll see. We'll start from the top though, right? And going back to January 20th, Inauguration Day, President Trump set out a number of executive orders, potentially the most consequential for this week, but also for his economic plan was his America First trade policy executive order. That set in motion a lot of activities and reports from his staff at the White House related to trade and tariff policy. Obviously, this is something that we saw play out to a lesser extent, of course, but certainly just as impactful in the first Trump administration with the Section 301 tariffs on goods coming from China and their impact on the home furnishings industry. And that executive order on January 20th set out several deadlines as it related to tariff policy and how things would be different and what positions the second Trump administration would take as it relates to trade and tariffs. Set out those reports to be delivered to the president on April 1st. And so building to that, right, the president declared April 2nd, 2025 as Liberation Day. That was the day that he chose to announce the findings from those reports and then connecting that to whatever the tariff rates are going to be, what that tariff policy was going to be. We didn't know till that afternoon. Obviously, there's a lot of actions in between the announcements on April 2nd as it relates to tariffs. We saw early on in the administration, again, on January 20th, a national emergency declared at our border as it related to fentanyl coming through the northern and southern border and also implicated China. The national emergency declaration was important in that instance and also for these reciprocal tariffs because it allowed the president to claim the authority granted to the executive under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Again, this is legislation from the 1970s that has never been used before to implement tariffs. It's been used as a threat, as a precursor to potential tariffs, but never actually implemented. And so that process under IEEPA, again, stands in contrast to the Section 301 investigations, Section 232 investigations that we're perhaps more familiar with given the tariffs in place on goods imported from China and some of the steel aluminum tariffs that have been in place and now been expanded in this administration. The main differences being in those Section 301 and Section 232 processes, there's sort of a notice and comment period. So stakeholders like furniture retailers and other entities can comment about the impact of these investigations. There's a process, there's public hearings, and in fact, HFA testified both publicly as well as submitted written comments during those Section 301 investigations. Under IEEPA, these actions can be taken by the executive and be put into effect almost immediately, right? Without that public comment process. And so, again, going back a couple of days to April 2nd with the announcement of the reciprocal tariff policies, one of the first things in the president's remarks was he declared a national emergency around these persistent and growing trade deficits that the U.S. has had with its trading partners. And so, again, that language around trade emergencies and that national emergency allowed the president in this case, right, as it relates to the reciprocal tariffs, to claim his authority under IEEPA to implement these tariffs, these reciprocal tariffs. And so that's an important point, and something that, again, leading up to April 2nd, there were a lot of questions and sort of predictions of what authority would be used. Would it be Section 301 where there was an investigation, something like that, a more kind of orderly process? Now we know that's not the case. And, these tariffs, and again, we're filming this on April the 4th. They haven't gone into effect yet, but they will be going into effect in the coming days per the executive order. Thinking back to, again, Section 301 and tariffs that were put in place on goods coming from China back in 2018, 2019, and the effect to the home furnishings industry, folks that are watching this recording will remember and understand and kind of reflect on the acceleration that led to of our global supply chain of exiting China and shifting to other countries in Southeast Asia, notably Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, India. Again, ostensibly, one of the goals of those initial Section 301 tariffs was to shift the supply chain. That was happening. That was happening at a pretty significant rate, especially in our industry. I think the goal now, especially with this reciprocal tariff policy, is different, right? We're not just focused on China. Now, this policy that we can get into applies to all of our trading partners, all countries across the world. And the president has been clear that he wants a reshoring of certainly manufacturing jobs, but other industries as well, back to the United States as a result of this tariff policy. Again, we're early on in the process. We'll see how that ultimately plays out, but we've shifted from, kind of exiting China on the supply chain side and more aggressively leaning into reshoring industries back to the United States. That's ultimately the goal. And so with that in mind, the president and his team at the White House, under the direction of that executive order, compiled a list and looked at, existing, and again, a lot of these things have been in place for several years, decades, in fact, sort of tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade for U.S. made goods in foreign markets, right? A lot's been made about, for instance, tariffs placed on U.S. made automobiles into the European Union, for an example. But there's also other elements that the administration looked at across the world, across the globe from different markets about other barriers, not just tariffs, but value-added taxes, other, regulatory policies that may infringe on U.S. company access to a given market. And the administration quantified those elements and determined that they were going to institute a, essentially worldwide, to apply to all countries at a minimum 10% tariff on goods imported to the United States. Again, this is something that we heard throughout the campaign for President Trump talk about, this idea about a a global tariff. I believe in the executive order was referred to as a supplemental global tariff. And so, initially, this executive order from April 2nd sets that minimum tariff at 10%. Additionally, building on that, for several of our other more high volume trading partners, and there's an extensive list that I believe there's a link to on the HFA website via the executive order that adjusts that tariff rate above and beyond 10% for other countries based on those other tariff and non-tariff barriers that we previously discussed. And so, again, some of the more notable rates for countries in Southeast Asia that comprise a majority of the home furnishing supply chain include an additional 34% on goods imported from China. And again, that's additive to existing Section 301 tariffs on goods imported from China. That's 25%. Plus, there's an additional 20% that was put on via the national emergency related to fentanyl. And then you add another 34% onto that. So an effective tariff rate on goods from China, again, at a minimum, depending on of their, what sort of materials they're made of 79%. Those are things coming from China. Again, thinking about what we heard during the campaign, potentially looking at China getting to 60, 70, now, of course, potentially closer to 80% at a baseline. Vietnam, their tariff rate was set at 46%. A significant, one of the higher rates for some of these adjusted countries. Indonesia, I believe, was at 32%, India in the mid to upper 20s. And so these are significant tariff rates that have now been placed, again, an adjusted basis on some of our high volume trading partners. Those adjusted rates go into effect as of midnight on April the 9th, which is this upcoming Wednesday, depending on when you're watching this video. Now, importantly to note, and again, still looking into some of the final definitions here because words matter. So as we're looking at, some of the verbiage and definitions, essentially goods that have been pulled from the warehouse and are on a vessel or a ship to the United States as their destination, those goods that have been pulled and are on that vessel before midnight of April 9th would not be subject to these additional duties. They'd be subject to whatever the current regime is. But anything sort of pulled from a warehouse and entered into the United States after midnight, essentially on April 9th, would then be subject to these adjusted rates based on their country of origin, where they're coming from. And so that list of countries and those rates is, again, linked on the HFA website, came from the executive order under Annex 1, lists all the countries and those adjusted rates. So that's obviously significant, right? As far as those specific rates go. Obviously, HFA, a lot of our partners too, have been asked, whether it's by industry folks or even the media, about impacts of these tariffs. I think we're still trying to see how that will play out given shipping, inventory levels, and those other factors. But clearly, I think just looking at these rates, the supply chain, and how previously the experience worked with goods from China, especially on 301, it's difficult to escape how these costs will not be passed on to the consumer, right? And so we're still obviously digesting that. For those that have some stories or thoughts, impacts of that, feel free to connect with HFA leadership and staff, because having some of those stories will help us as we're sort of determining and walking through our narrative when we're talking to policymakers and others as we're further understanding the impact of these tariffs. One other piece that has been an important section that we're looking at with this executive order as it relates to exemptions and what is covered. There is another separate list within the executive order dubbed Annex 2, which I believe is also on the HFA website, that lists specific products, product categories, and HTS codes of goods that would be exempted from these additive tariffs. Generally speaking, and again, I would refer you to the text of the executive order. We believe that the White House determined that these additional adjusted rates could not be additive to products currently covered by a Section 232 finding, where a separate rate has been in place. So I'm thinking about specifically steel and aluminum products. There is an existing Section 232 finding that now applies to all steel and aluminum imported into the United States of 25%. There's a 25% tariff. These additional tariffs would not be additive to those. So to those products covered under Section 232. So looking through those exemptions, there has been a point of contention within that section as it relates to home furnishings, because it does specifically call out in the exemptions piece lumber articles, and there are some more raw materials, I would say, like plywood, MDF, particle board, included in Annex 2 as being exempted, again, for the time being, as it relates to these reciprocal tariffs. But then there's also language in that section respective to all products that may be covered by a future Section 232 finding. For those that are aware, and then of course for those that aren't, there is an ongoing Section 232. And again, when we speak to Section 232, the nexus for that is A, the Department of Commerce runs that investigation, and B, it's connected to national security. There's an ongoing investigation right now related to lumber and its derivative products, i.e. furniture. So there has been some, I think, whether it's confusion or differing viewpoints as to what that covers, right? Like, would that all products subject to a future investigation, knowing that there is one in the pipeline, would that cover those products right now for the time being while there is no finding? Because Chapter 94 generally, which is the finished product category for most home furnishings products, is not listed specifically in Annex 2. Right now, we're taking the position that the exemption does not apply to those finished products. I'm in the process of trying to get some additional clarification on that, but that's been an ongoing discussion, I think, within the industry. Wanted to give kind of our specific viewpoint on that as we've looked into this and talked to different stakeholders here. But again, hopefully these sorts of discrepancies can be covered over the next several days as we look at the impact and trying to determine some of these exact definitions and how these things will then interplay as this gets implemented over the coming days. So, I think at a high level covered the nature of the reciprocal order, how those things will go into effect, when they will, how they will. And, ultimately the administration, obviously over the last couple of days, there's been some turmoil, not just in the stock market, but then with stakeholders on Capitol Hill and the potential for broader economic disruption. We'll have to see, right? I think, as we said, this is one piece of the president's domestic agenda. Certainly, just looking at tariffs, I think the administration would say we're not just talking about the trade policy, we're talking about tax policy, which is another piece that Congress is looking at. They're looking at deregulation and combining those efforts. How will that affect the general economic tone, not just for our industry, but the economy moving forward. And so while we're looking at trade today, and certainly in the next in the coming days, weeks, and months, also aware that this is part of a broader movement from the administration. Obviously, in the meantime, feels like there's going to be some short-term pain. I think everyone's still trying to determine what that level will be and how it will be felt for American consumers, but also businesses, retailers like yourselves, as we're navigating this sort of unprecedented action that President Trump has taken. Also connected to the reciprocal tariff piece in this a separate executive order, but something that's been discussed and looked at over the last several months is the de minimis exemption for goods entering the United States with a value of less than $800. And this is something that our industry has raised in recent Washington, D.C. fly-ins with members of Congress, specifically about products entering the U.S. market that may not be compliant with various regulations, whether those are product safety or potentially some of these slave labor regulations that have been put in place over the last couple of years based on legislation that Congress has passed in a bipartisan way. That threshold for under $800 currently allows products to enter the United States without paying tariffs or duties and without having to do, with giving very limited information to Customs and Border Protection, CBP. And so that has been an area that Congress and, not only this administration, but the Biden administration looked into as well. And so another executive order beginning May 2nd, this administration is prepared to move forward to eliminate that de minimis exemption for goods coming from China. Most of the focus has been on a couple of Chinese companies, Shein and Temu. I don't know that we've seen them compete directly in the home furnishing space, but certainly there are a lot of products on their sites that, again, are right now coming in duty-free and essentially inspection-free. And so the Trump administration is setting up a separate entry system for those goods now coming from China. De minimis will still apply for the time being for goods coming from other countries, but specifically from China, the postal carriers now are going to be responsible for collecting duties of either 30% of the item's value or $25 per item, which will then increase on June 1st of 2025. So basically it goes into effect May 2nd for a month, then it'll be at $25 an item max, and then on June 1st it will go up to $50 per item. That will be in effect for goods coming from China. That essentially eliminates that de minimis exemption for those goods. Again, something that we've raised as an industry with stakeholders on Capitol Hill and recent DC fly-ins. Hopefully that will level the playing field on those items so that we're all sort of competing under the same set of circumstances. This is going to be something new. Obviously, those shipments under $800 have grown exponentially over the last several years. So there's definitely going to be an increase in activity for Customs and Border Protection. We'll see how that plays out. Initially, the administration tried to eliminate the de minimis exemption via executive order a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of chaos at the border, so they had to sort of pause that while the Department of Commerce worked up an entry process. That has been settled now, and this will be the new entry method for goods from China under that existing de minimis threshold. And so we'll have to monitor how that plays out specifically, but again, wanted to raise it here in case it was one of those issues, because it was sort of less, because it came out the same day as the reciprocal tariff piece. It was less reported on, but I think still consequential for our industry and others. And again, we have a little bit of a blog post connected to these issues, but also the de minimis piece that we've raised too. And I've connected that back to the DC fly-in. Our association does have an upcoming fly-in in the middle of May 13, 14, 15 in DC. Obviously, these trade issues are top of mind this week and beyond, but there are other issues as it relates to the economy, the regulatory issues, and other pieces directly impacting the furniture retail space that it would be great to get your voice into DC to really deliver that message to policymakers about how these policies on the trade side, but also in some of those other areas are affecting your businesses, your customers. And so we welcome additional input from HFA members on that. We've covered a lot of ground. It's been an interesting week. There was a lot of buildup, and I think safe to say that the order on reciprocal tariffs was something that, again, never seen before. Still, of course, digesting key parts of it, but obviously this is meant, as we discussed, as overall to bring jobs back to the United States. It resets essentially all of our trading relationships across the world. And, the administration has said every country has called them, right? And so, what is the tangible effect here when it's all said and done? Will we get a more fair trade policy with our trading partners across the world as a result of this? That remains to be seen. In the meantime, with the HFA team and our team here in DC, we're still working to interpret this order as if it's going to go into effect April 9th and what those consequences will be. We've already seen some announcements from countries about retaliatory tariffs, how that will affect the domestic industry, and not just ours, but others. Again, what will those factors weigh on the economy? How will that affect things moving forward? Seems like we'll have another one of these on some of those other topics, but it's been great to catch up and provide this video download. And again, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to the HFA team. We talk regularly, as you can imagine, on a number of things, and we'd appreciate any additional input that you all have as far as the impact to your businesses. And with that, I will leave you back to your Friday, and it's going to be another busy week in DC next week, and we'll look forward to providing additional feedback and analysis on these issues moving forward.